Chapter 9 of The Whistling Mountain by Mary Daem. "You can't go to town looking like that," Mrs. Dunn laughed when she had finished admiring the remains of the puffballs. "Look at your face and hands. Better wash them twice." David looked in the mirror and let out a war whoop. He was filthy. His whole face was so brown from the puffballs that he looked as though he were wearing a mask. Only his eyes looked like his own. He had to scrub himself 3 times to get the stuff off. He had barely finished when the men came up the trail. "The trail gang are eating with us today," his mother explained, as she dished out stew with dumplings. "They'll cook for themselves tomorrow." David hastily dried his hands and slicked down his hair. He was thankful he had managed to get out of the bushes before they came home. He'd certainly have been in trouble if he hadn't. And perhaps he'd better not mention it. After all, he was not supposed to have left the trail or gone out of sight of the house. There was no use asking for trouble. The men were tired and they were hungry. They didn't talk much until they had finished eating, but then they found time to listen as David told them about the strange mushrooms he had found and the fun he had had squeezing dust from them. "You should have seen his face," his mother laughed. "Oh, you found the puffball," Big John explained, rubbing his stomach and pushing back his chair. "That's a good thing. They make good eating when they're young and white. Slice them and fry them in butter, and there's a use for the puff, too." David looked puzzled, and Big John laughed. "Sometimes in the bush back home in Australia," he explained, "we get a little cut and it bleeds. So we find a puffball all brown, and we pick 'em and make 'em puff right into the cut, and the bleeding stops." Barney, the other member of the trail gang, nodded in agreement. "Where did you find those puffballs, son?" Mr. Dunn asked. For a second, David couldn't think what to say. "Behind some bushes, Dad," he managed, but he thought his father looked at him in a queer sort of way. He hoped he wasn't going to ask any more questions. He'd better change that subject fast. "Did you hear any marmots on my mountain, Dad?" "Yes, and we saw 1 or 2, though we didn't get up very far. Had to repair the bridge over the river before we could get across." David's eyes sparkled. "Do you have to cross a river to get to Whistling Mountain?" "Why, yes, that's the Swiftwater. Don't you remember crossing it when you got off the train?" David nodded. Then he had guessed right. More than ever, he wanted to get to his mountain and to climb it to the very top. And he was going to. Hadn't he found his way home all by himself when he'd been lost? He quite forgot to remind himself that he should never have been lost in the first place. "I'll help with the dishes," he offered, when the men had gone. "Then we can get started sooner. The wood box needs filling too. I almost called you to fill it in the middle of the morning. Try not to forget it again." David let his breath out slowly. Another narrow escape. If his mother had called him and he hadn't answered, he was just plain lucky. "I hope you're feeling strong, David," his mother smiled at him as she tied her dirty walking shoes and made sure she had her purse and her handkerchief. "I've got a shopping list a mile long." She took a stout stick in her hand, "just in case we meet a bear," and they started down the trail. It's a beautiful day. High overhead, the branches of the tall trees were dark against the bluest of skies. A gentle breeze teased the wild grasses, and the sides of the path were splashed with yellow arnica and purple lupin. David's mother exclaimed in delight at each new patch of flowers. "Look at them, all growing wild. I wish I could show some of our friends back in the apartment. They'd never believe me." "Look up there, Mother," David pointed. "Look at all those baby trees. They look as if someone planted them. Do you suppose they did?" Mrs. Dunn looked up at the bank where David had pointed. There were dozens and dozens of little trees growing together on the sunny bank. Some of them were only inches high. "Look up as high as you can, David," she suggested. "Look at those big trees and the cones they have on them. Those cones contain seeds, and when the cones get heavy and fall, the seeds are thrown into the soft earth. They begin to grow, and if they have enough room and get enough sunshine and rain, those seeds grow from tiny trees like those on the bank to these enormous ones above them. It takes a long, long time." David looked at his mother with new respect. He hadn't realized she knew so much about nature. Do you know much about marmots, Mom? I know that they whistle and you don't, she teased. Where right in front of them a big dark bird flew almost straight up and perched on a low branch. Mrs. Dunn let out one startled exclamation and whirled about, all ready to run back to the cabin. Where are you going, Mother? David called. The town is down this way. Mrs. Dunn felt so foolish when David showed her what had frightened her that she couldn't help laughing at herself. But you weren't frightened at all, she marveled, looking down at David as he walked beside her. I was a little, he mumbled, remembering that he had been frightened once before by a similar bird. There were so many things to see and so many things to talk about that it seemed scarcely any time at all before David spotted the schoolhouse through the trees. Certainly it was much easier to come down the trail than it had been to go up, and of course now they were not carrying boxes and bundles. Look, there's the school. Mother, do I really have to go to school in that little place? Yes, you really do. It won't be half as bad as you think it will be. You'll soon make friends. David wasn't convinced. The school was so small and so different from the one in Vancouver. And how did you make friends when you didn't know anyone? And how would he ever get to school? He wasn't even allowed out of the yard alone. He tried to tell his mother how he felt. David, it is only because you aren't used to living away up on a mountain that we want you to stay close by. When we were in the city, there were street signs to show you the way. And if you did make a mistake, you could always stop and ask a policeman where you were. I know you used to go to school alone, and you could go on errands for me and ride on a bus all by yourself. But we are living now where it is really wild. You could get lost just by stepping off the trail. The brush is so thick. Your daddy doesn't want to frighten you, but bears can be dangerous if you frighten them, or if you get between them and their cubs. You haven't yet learned that you have to do what you are told for your own safety. David felt a bit uncomfortable. He hated being told over and over again about obeying rules, but he had learned that very morning how easily he could become lost. He kicked at the damp earth with the toe of his shoe. How will I get to school then if I can't go alone? School doesn't start until September, and for a little while your father will probably go with you. It won't be much longer than a month that you'll have to come down that trail like we did today. It's a long distance to walk. David's eyes danced. You mean I can get another bicycle or ride a horse, maybe? Mrs. Dunn laughed out loud. Can't you just see yourself flying down that bumpy trail on a bicycle and then having to push it all the way up again? And what would your horse do while you were in school? David began to smile. Perhaps we never thought to explain to you that we won't be living all winter long in that cabin. When the snow comes, we will move right into Swiftwater for the winter. Your father will make several trips up the mountain on snowshoes to shovel off the roofs and to see that everything is all right, but he doesn't need to live up there all winter. David thought about that until they reached the steps of the general store. A boy, just about David's age, was sitting there, carving a willow switch. Hello, he greeted them in a friendly fashion. Want to see what I'm doing? David very much wanted to see, but he was suddenly shy. He could only manage a nod. The boy held up a piece of wood up to David. It was about 6 inches long, and he had been carving it with an old jackknife. To David, the bit of wood didn't look like anything at all. What is it? He asked, turning it round and round in his fingers. Oh, it isn't finished yet, but I know what it's going to be. It's going to be a whistle, like the one my big brother made, see? He dug in his pocket, and he brought out a bit of stick. It was old and cracked, but when he put it to his lips and blew, the most piercing, penetrating sound emerged. David looked suitably impressed. My name's David, he confided. Say, do you think I could learn to make a whistle like that? Sure, I'll show you. And I'm Eric. My dad's on the section. David looked so puzzled that he explained further. The railroad section. He fixes the tracks and things. We live in that red house over there. He pointed across the bridge. Do you go to that school too? Sure, our teacher's lots of fun. There's only 10 of us, so we get to go do lots of things like go on hikes and picnics. The teacher taught my brother how to make these whistles. David's new friend explained as he twisted his knife and tapped the handle against the willow to loosen the bark. You watch now. Time simply flew, and when David heard his mother calling him to help with her purchases, he gave a real start. He had forgotten all about her. Mother, he remembered, when he'd taken a brown paper bag in one hand and a roll of papers in the other, this is Eric. He goes to school and he's showing me how to make a whistle. Eric scrabbled to his feet and smiled shyly. Here. He thrust his hand into David's pocket. You take it. I can make more. And I'll come up to see you someday if my mother will let me. Only I guess she won't. She's scared of bears. He turned and ran across the bridge toward the red house. Eric's my friend, and if he says the school is nice, I guess it will be, David concluded. Only it doesn't look nearly as nice and new as the one in Vancouver. No one in Vancouver taught you how to make a willow whistle, now did they? No, David answered, and his voice was cheerful. There are lots of things I'm going to like about this place. That's the end of chapter 9.